Alright, so right quick before the video starts, I just wanted to get something out of the way here. Well, first, just kind of a matter of quick note, is that right around 6 minutes to 9 minutes, right around in there, there's a disconnect between the audio and the video. And I know it's really annoying to watch videos that the audio and the video don't line up, but I don't have the software to really correct that. So I'm sorry about that, but it does correct right around 9 minutes and it's back to normal. So it took me a little while to decide whether or not to actually share the video. So this particular clip is being recorded after the video that's going to come later. It took me a little while to share it because I wanted to make sure this time that everyone understood what's going on in my head when I'm talking about the moral problem of theism. And in order to do that, the video, the sort of commentary here goes to some very dark topics, and so be warned. There's some dark topics in here, and I'm hoping that if you hear the topics that are being discussed in relation to theism, and it leaves you with a kind of sinking feeling in your stomach, then you might get some idea of how I feel when I consider theism. You might understand the problem there. And in the end, part of the issue was that I know that people that I talk to regularly, are part of the small little group of people that watch these videos that I share on YouTube. And this particular video, like I said, it gets kind of dark, and I'm hoping that it doesn't ruin anyone's day because they watched it. So just be aware that this video dives into the moral problems of theism and the theistic belief system, just the moral consequence of holding to that belief system. And I'm hoping that no one listens to it and thinks that I'm referring to any one in particular. It's when I talk about that because of all these things, the theistic belief is a belief not worth holding, I'm referring to my own consideration of my holding that belief. I'm not referring to anyone specifically. That's just when I consider it, it's not worth keeping. So hopefully you can keep that in mind, and hopefully this explains a few things when it comes to understanding the moral problem with theism. Okay, so I wanted to do a kind of summary of where these discussions on morality are at, and try to clarify what seems to be something people are missing about this discussion. And I think the best way to do that is to really try to sort of crystallize the difference, what is really standing between myself and theism. So I'm going to do my best. I thought that I've thought I'd covered this thoroughly in the past, and I've gone back and tried to look at some of these videos, but from what people are telling me, it's just sort of not real clear. So I'm going to have another whack at this. So I've tried to write down the thoughts that I want to go over. So some of this is going to be me reading the stuff that I've written, because I want to make sure that I cover all these topics. So I think it's probably necessary to go back over before we start into this conversation, and to sort of preempt some of the objections that I can imagine coming from people as far as this relates to the Deistic God. So Thomas Paine and others, this is sort of, the best way that I know how to describe it is the way that Thomas Paine described it, where he said that the only idea man can affix to God is that of a first cause. And that sort of rang true with me in a lot of ways, which we'll get into here, but it doesn't go beyond that. So if you would say that God is the uncaused first cause, the prime mover, the initiator that set all things in motion, It's important to understand that the Theistic God is not personal, intervening, observant, concerned, omniscient. These are all sort of anthropomorphic things. These are ways of describing our own condition, except for omniscient, of course. Ways of describing our own condition that we try to attribute to God. This is, the thing that's sort of represented in that we're made in God's image is more of an attempt to make him like us than is really justified. So things like choice, intent, all these things are stuff that we observe in the phenomena of our own actions that we assume must then apply to God. So this raft of other concepts that comes along with God is what's rejected as unsupported and in many cases unneeded. So what we're going to get to here is, the moral problem with the theistic God and how that plays into all these discussions. So what you get with the existence of the theistic God is a kind of moral conundrum. If such a God exists, why would he allow wicked acts to take place and not stop them? Now, this is a problem dismissed by many, but I think that's because they don't understand the real depth and significance of this problem. So, think about what the best way is to put it. This is morality. When we talk about things being moral or immoral, what we're talking about is how you behave. Moral and immoral are descriptive terms about someone's behavior. Okay, and the existence of the moral God, which is what theism claims, is the existence of this sort of perfectly moral agency, this thing approaching human, that exists out there somewhere. You run into the problem of complacency because, like I said, moral and immoral are ways in which we describe behavior. It's not tied to anything else. It's just behavior, how someone behaves. So the existence of the perfectly moral God, seeing, for example, the suffering of a child, for example, and does nothing. The proposition of the theistic God offers the believer a way to work around this problem, and it's an immoral way of working around it, and I'll get to that. But this is essentially how this works. As you've seen in all three discussions, to claim from God's perspective, these events are all part of the plan, and we can't understand, all part of his plan. We can't understand it. This is a step that I feel not only can, but must be taken to really maintain your position as a theist. And it has to do with the root of this problem of complacency. Standing by and letting these things happen. If I decide to go commit a wicked action, unless another person sees me and decides to stop me, no one's going to. God's not going to stop me. We all know this. The only way to work around that is to say that there's a divine plan. There's some kind of order. All this balances out in the end. This is the moral way to go about it. All this is going to work out at the end of all the time, you could say. I've heard it many times, but as far as these three discussion partners go, the latest brought it up. I think. I don't remember the others bringing it up, but they could have. The Genesis 50, where Joseph's brothers are sort of worried that he's going to have them put to death, punish them somehow because they sold him into slavery at an earlier time. And essentially what he says here, I've got it written down. So this is what is reportedly is that he said to them. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Now, they take this passage, which really what it's referring to is what Joseph was able to accomplish in Egypt, and as the story goes. But they say, okay, what we're going to do is take that and say that's how all this works. That whenever someone does something for evil, God meant it for good, and that sort of gets around the moral problem in this sort of dodgy way, where they can say, no, well, it's it's wrong, of course. You heard some of the speakers saying, of course, these behaviors are wrong, and that person will be punished in the end. But and that presents its own contradictory issues with when you think about God being in control of everything that happens. But we're not going to get into that. But say, okay, it's wrong, it's evil. But in the end, that was allowed to happen. Now, when you view God as perfectly moral, now we come to a further understanding, and that's that of all the possible paths the universe could have taken, that this is the most moral way to achieve God's most moral goal. Now, that means, when presented with an immoral act, then you can say any other way would have been immoral to go about. So if God were to stop this, somehow in the end it would have been a less moral conclusion. Now, if you really think this out and you're a theist, you would agree here. The three speakers, discussion partners that I've had so far on this topic, all were very, very honest about this. They all, kind of came forward and they understood that this is inevitable with the belief in a theistic God, that you have to say, okay, this is the terrible things that happen are going to balance out in the end. This is what had to happen for all this to work, to accomplish this God's grand plan. You meant it for evil, but he meant it for good, and again, it creates its own problems when you talk about punishing people for what God intended to happen, but we're not going to get into that. But everybody's heard this, right? Everyone has heard people say things like, God knows what he's doing. This God works in mysterious ways. We can't pretend to know God's plan. This kind of stuff. This is inevitable from the theistic position. Now, I wanted to make sure. So let me see where I'm at here. Yeah. So that's you have first the conclusion that that all this plays out right in the end. That what's allowed to happen is part of God's plan, and in the end, that was the most moral way to go about this. So we have this passage that says, God meant it for evil, or the man meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Then when you view this extreme, you push that out farther, follow these assumptions as far as they'll go, then you'll arrive at the conclusion that the most moral thing for God to do is to allow what has happened to happen. Any other result is not worth having, because that would mean that God didn't choose the most moral path for the universe. So we've got those two things so far. That when looking at any wicked act, those two things so far. Any other verse, any universe in which these things don't happen is not worth having. Christianity specifically has, particularly for me, it has this concept, of original sin, where people are born guilty, born with the sin of Adam. The most, let me make sure I'm so. Christianity takes this additional step in which they claim that all humans are deserving of death. So allowing this kind of suffering to take place is simply humans getting what they chose. Like I said, the unsupported and illogical part of this is that it includes infants. And some people say that our mortality itself, our ability to die, has to do with Adam's actions. And that, when an infant dies, that's because someone else did thousands of years ago. Immoral and wicked and unreasonable as that is, it sort of offers him this other handle on all this. And it's all playing out as part of God's plan, and there's a grand divine conclusion to all this. So, curiously, another verse is often quoted when you start pointing out these things. And it's because when someone claims that our morality is a reflection of God, what they'll also say is, they'll quote this verse in which it says, "My ways are not your ways." And they'll say that's what we need to look at whenever we have a moral conviction that doesn't, line up with claims of God's behavior. Which essentially means you can never make a moral objection to claims made of God's behavior, which is problematic in its own right. But that part's not specifically relevant. But this claim that our morals are reflected by God, but then also His ways are not our ways, is a little bit contradictory. But that could be dug into a little bit more later. All right. So just to summarize the position. If you commit a wicked act, you'll be punished. It was wrong, but from a grand overall perspective, it was justified in the eyes of God. And His allowing it to happen, was justified in the eyes of God. And His unwillingness to stop it reflects His knowledge of a grand plan and knowledge of what is to come. This is, again, in my opinion, inevitable conclusion of believing in the theistic God. It's the only thing that lets you bypass the problem of complacency. So, what I want to get to next, I want to just make sure you understand that last part. If you commit a wicked act, you'll be punished. It was wrong, but from a grand overall perspective, it's justified in the eyes of God to not stop this. So if you're a theist watching this, I want to, and this is going to sound cheesy, but I just want to make sure that I approach this next half of the video the right way. I'm just going to give you a second to really let that concept settle in your head before we move on. All right, so in these discussions, you've heard me reference the girl in Tennessee. Now, it's been vague because I only read about this case once, and it was really disturbing. And as far as reported acts of human behavior go, it's probably the most disturbing thing that I've ever read. And I didn't follow up on it to see what was going on with all that. What was the outcome of all that? How did it go? And that the best I could remember was that I thought it was in Tennessee, and I knew that it was a girl under the age of 1, and I knew that it was permanent damage. Sorry about that, the phone beeped. I knew that it was a permanent damage issue. So what I wanted to run down the story, and I didn't particularly like running down the story, but I did. I found out what happened later, how all that played out in the end. I found out that I've actually been saying this wrong. It was in West Virginia. It wasn't in Tennessee. I was living in Georgia at the time, and I read about it. And like I said, I got the timing or the state wrong. It's in West Virginia. So I purposely had not followed up. Like I said, because it kind of disturbed me so much. But I actually found out that, as I was afraid to find out, that the girl later died from her injuries. She was 9 months old when this happened. And someone asked me in a previous discussion what innocent means. Well, this. She's innocent. As innocent as it gets. Deserving of no punishment, guilty of no crime. If innocent means anything, it describes this 9-month-old girl. And here's my opinion on that, and you can disagree if you want, but it's pretty resolved. If you feel otherwise, then that is a manifestation of the damage caused to your mind by religion, because there is no logical reason to conclude that she is sinful in any way, or guilty of any punishment, or deserving of any punishment. So just before, I wanted to make sure that I said that before we kept going here. So this might be, reading this is a little difficult, and, of course I should give a disclaimer to say, if you have a weak stomach or particularly sensitive on these issues, you might want to skip the next 5 or 6 minutes. All right, so I'm going to read from a few different news articles here and to let you know what happened, what I'm referring to when I refer to this girl, who, like I said, up to now I would say the girl in Tennessee, and what really I'm talking about was this case that happened in West Virginia. All right, a West Virginia man accused of sexually assaulting a 9-month-old girl who later died from her injuries was charged on Thursday with first-degree murder. The suspect, Benjamin Taylor, who is 32, is accused of attacking the baby of his girlfriend, Amanda Atkins, in the basement of their apartment they shared in Jackson County, according to court documents. Taylor of Cottageville, 38 miles north of the capital, Charleston, was found on Monday with the child, who was unresponsive and covered in blood. According to a court document, Taylor was found with blood on his body and told the sheriff's detective that he had blacked out. The girl died on Wednesday from an initial medical exam showed extensive injuries to her lower body and injuries including a skull fracture and widespread bruising, according to court documents. Taylor had been charged with first-degree sexual assault and was arraigned in Jackson County Magistrate Court for murder on Thursday. The incident sparked outrage. A petition to the White House for Taylor to be publicly hanged was posted on Wednesday and had drawn 3,110 signatures. West Virginia does not have the death penalty. Benjamin Taylor claimed he did not remember how his girlfriend's infant daughter, and her name was, it might be Emily, but for some reason I read the pronunciation, this is Emily Behringer, sustained severe internal trauma caused by the sex attack. He also claimed to have no idea how she suffered the severe blunt force injuries to the head that ended up killing her. Taylor told the jury in Jackson County, West Virginia, on Tuesday that he had been drinking all day before the gruesome October 2016 assault. He said the last thing he remembered was doing laundry. But a jury did not buy Taylor's claims and found him guilty of murder, sexual abuse by a guardian, and causing death by sexual abuse. The prosecutor, her name was Katie Franklin. This is what her description of what happened afterwards. What happened to Emily Behringer was almost incomprehensible. Taylor injured her, and he ripped her apart. Well, when she cried out, he put his hand over her mouth and silenced her, and when that didn't work, he slammed her head against the floor. The jury followed their guilty verdict with a sentence recommendation of no mercy. So there's a little bit of a description of what happened specifically that day. Amanda Atkins, Emily's mother, woke up that morning and found Taylor crouched over the infant with no shirt and unbuttoned jeans. Emily was lying in a pile of blankets. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was drying her off. I asked him why he was drying her off at 5 o'clock in the morning. She said she noticed that there was something wrong with the girl's face. She was covered in blood and was ice cold and gasping for breath. She called 911, and the rest. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department deputy that came out there, he said, as you might imagine, anyone in that case, just kind of describing the, how awful it was. Anyway. Now, if you understand what all happened there, this is what. Hopefully, I skipped over some parts there because I know I was going to have some trouble reading it. But here's the important thing now. Consider for a moment the following claims about this child. And I'm going to pause between each and just take a moment to let each claim detonate in your mind. Okay? This man meant this act for evil, but God meant it for good. The most moral thing for God to do is allow this to happen. Any universe in which this did not happen is not worth having. She is born with the sin of Adam, deserving of death. What happened to her was ultimately justified in the eyes of God. Now, this is, for me, acknowledging that the belief in the theistic God pushes you to that point. And you can disagree, and we can have that discussion, but it's unavoidable. Most people understand that it's inevitable. This is the realization of the quote that I often refer to, that from Stephen Weinberg, where he says, with or without religion, you'd have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, you need religion. The person that maintains this position is, to me, I have a moral conscience that condemns that view as evil and as wicked. I can't imagine holding that view and being morally serious and respect myself if I held the view that what happened to her was justified in the end. Moral people will maintain the position of theism that I've defined, and have said, based on no evidence whatsoever, that what happened to her will be made right in the end. That we mere humans just failed to see the design, and that allowing this to happen was the most moral thing for God to do. And if you do not believe that, and you're a theist, if you do not believe that last part, allowing this to happen was the most moral thing for God to do, then the God is, by definition, immoral. If he's observant, sentient, able to stop it, able to intervene, would make him, by definition, immoral. I hope that this kind of gets to what everyone may have been missing, is that it's this conclusion that the theistic position forces you to that is repulsive to me. And I try not to address this issue too directly, although the recent discussion partners have been, like I said, very honest in this. They haven't argued, because most people know that this is an inevitable conclusion. That the person, to me, the person that looks at what happened to her and says, the man meant that act for evil, but God meant it for good, that's not a person worth having in the universe. It's not a position worth holding. And if in the end I find out I'm wrong about this, I'll proudly defend the position that wasn't made right. That anyone who was moral, anyone or anything moral able to stop the act should have. I'll never abandon that position. Now, in my first debate, at the very end of it, I quoted Dostoevsky, and I don't know how deep Dostoevsky's writings go. It took me a long time to work my way through this, but I knew that it was quoted many times. But it addresses this specific case so perfectly, and the problem of the theistic position so perfectly, that it's worth repeating here. So in the novel, the character of Ivan is talking to Alyosha, and he says, and they've essentially arrived at this conclusion, that all these things will be made right in the end. He says, imagine that you yourself are building the edifice of human destiny with the object of making people happy in the finale, of giving them peace and rest at last. But for that, you must inevitably and unavoidably torture just one tiny creature, that same child who was beating her chest with her little fist, and raise your edifice on the foundation of her unrequited tears. This is referring directly to this concept. Would you agree to be the architect under such conditions? Tell me the truth. And Alyosha says, no, I would not agree. Then Ivan follows it up with a question directed at then the believer, not just directed about God, but at the believer themselves. And can you admit that the idea for the people whom you are building would agree to accept their happiness on the unjustified blood of a tortured child, and having accepted it, to remain happy forever? Alyosha says, I cannot admit it. This is perfectly the problem that we're talking about. The believer, once they realize this is the case, that theism pushes you to that point, they are then in the place of the second question. Can you admit that the people for whom you are building, this is, God is building the edifice, the timeline of human destiny. Could you admit that the idea that the people for whom you are building would agree to accept their happiness on the unjustified blood of the tortured child? That's what we're talking about. That's what all these discussions are about. For me, that's what all these discussions are about. You're accepting your happiness in the end on the unjustified blood of a tortured child. That's the theistic position. I hope that this got to the point, that this more clearly defines the issue and gets specifically to the problem that we've been talking about this whole time. The people who have reached out to me about these discussions have said, not in so many words, but that I'm not real well defining the problem here. And these discussions weren't intended to be a debate, which intended to be a discussion, to explore theistic morality and to show that this is part of it. This is part of believing that there's a moral, intervening God out there. Observant, able to stop things, and yet does not, results in a belief that puts you in this dilemma. And I, for one, just say, no thanks. I'm not going to voluntarily put myself in that situation. There's no way in which what happened to her shouldn't have been stopped by anyone able to do so. So, I hope that clears some things up. I don't know how long it'll take me to post this video. I really don't. So when I post it, it may have been recorded a week or two before that. So something to think about. If you really have an objection, let me know, and we can hash that out in a discussion.